Greetings to you all in the name of our Savior Jesus Christ. Thank you for tuning into this video where we are continuing to study the Gospel of Mark. In this video, we will look at Mark's Gospel chapter 7 verse 31 to 37. In our previous video, we saw Jesus ministering in Tyre and Sidon. And once he is done with that, he came to the region of Decapolis, which was near the Sea of Galilee. And as he reached Decapolis, the people of the region of Decapolis brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment or a speech problem. And they begged him to lay his hands on the sick man. What is surprising about the situation here? Almost a year ago, when Jesus visited Gerasenes and healed the demon-possessed man, as we read in chapter 5, verse 1 onwards, we see the people of the region begging Jesus to depart from the region because of the financial loss incurred by them as the swine had drowned in the sea. And at that time, when Jesus left the place, he told the man who was healed to go home to his friends and proclaim to them what the Lord had done for him. And we read there in Mark chapter 5 verse 20 that he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. So the man who was previously demon possessed, the legion, Decapolis was his hometown, and he went to his hometown and testified of Jesus, and everyone marveled. And that is why we see a favorable reaction in this place. That is why they begged Jesus to lay his hands on the sick person. The same area that Jesus sent the man to show his authority of the Lord is where he arrived right now. The people of Decapolis have seen the living witness of the man who was demon-possessed earlier. They knew how uncontrollable he was, how he was living in the tombs, how he wasn't in his right mind. They clearly saw the change in the man. In short, the man's living witness paved the way for a favorable situation that made Jesus welcomed in this region. As we read forward in this passage, Jesus takes the man away from the crowd and then puts his fingers into the ears of the deaf man. After spitting, Jesus touched his tongue. And then looking up to heaven, he sighed. So let's ask ourselves two questions here. Why would Jesus sigh? At what sight is he sighing? Jesus, the Son of God, God who took on flesh, came into the world, and he sees the damage that sin and disobedience of man that has caused damage into this world. Everywhere he looks, he sees sickness, he sees evil hearts, he sees death, he sees demon possession, man's unclean state that prevents him from entering God's presence. This is what he is seeing as he comes to the earth, and that is why he is sighing. All of these things happen in the world that is made through him. And when he looks up at heaven and sighs, he shows his sorrow for what has happened in creation. What Jesus does to the deaf and dumb man in healing him is noteworthy. He actually touches the man's ears and tongue. These organs are internal organs which are disgusting to touch with bare hands. Doctors touch these organs with gloved hands today. Now, after sighing, he said to him, Ephata. Ephata is an Aramaic word which Mark translates to the Gentile audience, and the translation goes like this: be opened. When Jesus said this, the man's ears were opened and his tongue was released. And then Jesus tells them not to tell anyone of what has happened. Well, why is that? We see that in chapter 5, verse 19 and 20, Jesus tells the demon-possessed man to go home and tell everyone. Whereas now, Jesus tells them not to tell anyone. The situation is different. Back in chapter 5, that happened almost 1 year ago from this incident, the people were not that aware of Jesus. He was a new person to them. But by this time, the place is full of awareness regarding who Jesus is. And with that awareness, there was a chance that the people would misunderstand Jesus' identity and make Jesus a king to fight against the Romans. And this is what Jesus wanted to avoid all the time. But we see that the more Jesus tells them not to tell anyone, the more zealously they proclaim it. Why are they more zealous regarding this? What Jesus did to the demon-possessed man was not witnessed by them. They didn't see the healing that Jesus did in chapter 5. They only knew of it from the testimony that the man gave them through his life. But now, in this passage, these people of Decapolis, they have heard and they are now seeing with their eyes what Jesus is doing. The reality of Jesus healing people hits them hard. The people of the region of Decapolis, on seeing this, are astonished beyond measure. And they express it by saying, "He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." Now, personally, I do not know how much the men of Decapolis knew the Jewish scriptures, which spoke of the messianic role of Jesus. What is the significance of Jesus doing all of these miracles? As we look in Isaiah chapter 35, verse 5 and 6, it talks of God who executes his judgment on the nations who are not on his side. And after that, we see the glory of God and his majesty. The redeemed will see God in action as he comes to save. What are the visible signs of the salvation that God will accomplish? Number 1, the eyes of the blind will be opened. Number 2, the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Number 3, the lame man will leap. Number 4, the tongue of the mute sings for joy. Jesus doing these miracles is the evidence of God's saving work that he does in the fallen world. This is the evidence that he will remove sins and its effects once and for all from the earth, and he will make all things new. These are the things that Jesus told the followers of John to communicate to John the Baptist. Let's give some lessons and applications from this passage. Lesson number 1. What gives us Christians immense joy in the face of physical ailments and sufferings that we have? The world that we are now living in at this moment is going through this deadly pandemic that we are all facing. Some countries are in their third wave, some in their second, and so on. We see children with physical ailments and terminal illnesses, and most importantly, we see death all around us. We, however, know as Christians that through Jesus Christ's death and resurrection, sin and its consequence is defeated at the cross. Jesus gave the preview of what will happen in the future when he will begin his eternal reign. This gives us the relief today that we who are co-heirs of Christ need not go through the sufferings and death for eternity. For Christians, suffering and death is temporal. It's not eternal. Jesus has given us a glimpse of what he will do in the eternity future by the miracles that he did on this earth 2000 years back. That is what gives us Christians immense joy. We who are belonging to Christ, have the hope that sin and death and all of the things that are characteristic of the sin-stricken world will all be removed, and we will one day be with the Lord, never to die again, never to be subject to tears and sorrow or death. The second lesson here is we see the zealousness of the people in Decapolis as they share aggressively what they saw Jesus doing. Sharing to others what God does through Jesus to us is something that must be done with zealousness. Gospel sharing must be done with zealousness. Why should it be done with zealousness? It is because we personally see the change that God brought in our lives. We shouldn't approach gospel sharing as a mere activity that we tick at the end of the week. It is not something that we do to fulfill our weekly check boxes. We do this because the change that God has brought into our lives is real. It should reflect in the passion in which we share the gospel. The people of Decapolis knew the helplessness of the demon-possessed man and the man who was deaf and dumb. They now know the change which has happened to them. And that is why these people are so zealous about the way they are sharing about Jesus. Lesson number 3. We are also reminded of Jesus, who has come into this world to redeem us. And in that process, he empathizes with us who are experiencing all the evil consequences of sin. Jesus identifies with us as he gets his hands dirty in restoring us back to God. Proof? Look at what Jesus did here in this passage as he healed the man who was deaf and dumb. He could have stood aloof and ordered, and that healing would have taken place. But then he chose to touch the man, and that is where he partakes. He shows that he partakes of our sufferings to rescue us from the bondage of sin. He partook of our flesh and blood to be a part of our experience so that we would be redeemed from sin. Lesson number 4. We can never fake a God-pleasing lifestyle. We can never fake the behavior of a regenerate person. Such a behavior comes from the direct intervention of God on our hearts. Such an intervention brings out the behavioral change that God demands. The demon-possessed man's life before and after the healing is so real and so much evident in their contrast. Such a change of action and attitude can't be faked. It only comes from a real transformation. So don't try to act holy when you are not holy from within. Let me repeat it. Don't try to act holy when you aren't holy from within. The fifth lesson that I would want to bring out from this passage is the one thing that we need to realize regarding the effectiveness of Christian evangelism and growth of Christian ministry. The growth of Christian ministry and evangelism depends largely on the testimony and the life of Christians in the area of their residence and workplaces. Why is there difficulty in sharing the gospel in some places? Why are they hostile and unwilling to respond positively to the gospel? Often it's because the message that they're hearing about Jesus is being processed in their minds and compared to the lives of those so-called Christians who do not reflect these change of lives in their claims. Sometimes unbelievers may have had bad experiences, have had bad experience with people who didn't show Christ-likeness. They have had a bad experience in which Christians didn't show Christ-likeness. As we share the gospel, those people ask us, is such and such person coming into your church? And when we say yes, they will say, I don't want his God. That's the sad part of the failure of missions today. The failure of missions is because of the failure of Christians to live out their Christian life. So a lesson that I would want to bring out here is, just as we see that the changed life of the demon-possessed man made the people wait eagerly for Jesus who would eventually arrive at Decapolis, we should realize that a radically changed life is what makes others receptive to Christ. Sadly, some believers don't have a godly testimony in their native places, and hence they don't have an access to share the gospel with them. Once our lives are evidently right with God, we have a chance to evangelize. Remember these things. People watch and observe our actions as our actions are louder than words. Once we lose our testimony, there is practically no chance to restore anything to a point where we can share the gospel. The last thing we need to remember is people may or may not believe what we say. That's up to them. But they cannot deny the godly life that they witnessed. They cannot deny that they saw someone who was Christ-like in front of them. May these words ring in our hearts and help us to be better witnesses of God wherever we are staying. And may God help us all to attract more people for Him through Christ. May God's name be glorified.